At 9:17 that morning, the jungle felt like it snapped awake around one ruined bunker. 14 Americans were already dead in that grove, each from a single shot no one ever saw coming. Second Lieutenant John George didn't flinch. He eased his cheek against a cold rifle stock, mud drying on his sleeves. The air smelled of rot, old smoke, and a kind of danger only men in trees can create. 240 yards out, a banyan tree the size of a courthouse towered over the grove. Something moved high in its branches. Just a twitch, too deliberate to be wind. George breathed once, slow, the way a man does when he knows another man is hunting him. He set the crosshairs and felt the world shrink to a tiny circle of glass. And the rifle the other officers had mocked for 6 weeks began to prove every one of them wrong. Now, partner, before we go any deeper, let me ask a small favor. If you enjoy stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. It helps more than you think. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. Would you, if it's getting late, take care of yourself first? We're not 20 anymore. You can always come back to this story when you feel rested. That morning on Guadalcanal, George lay inside the splintered guts of a Japanese bunker. The sandbags were torn, the timbers charred, and the metal fittings still held the smell of the men who'd built it. He was 27, a state champion marksman from Illinois, and until that week he hadn't fired a single shot in combat. His battalion had taken over for the Marines just after Christmas, stepping into a landscape full of shadows and ghosts, the kind of place where a man's nerves never fully sit still. For 3 days, the Japanese snipers had worked the coconut groves like a pack of wolves, and every hour or so, someone in George's regiment went down with a single neat wound. 14 Americans had been killed in 72 hours, and their officers didn't know where the shots came from or how many shooters were out there. But they all knew the same thing. The man who landed a bullet in your neck never fired twice. George had brought something different into that jungle, something that looked more like a deer rifle than military hardware. A Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope, bought with 2 years of National Guard pay, shipped across the country in a wooden crate he'd begged the Army to forward. The battalion armorer had laughed, said it belonged in a tree stand, not a battlefield. His captain told him to leave it in his tent and carry a real weapon like everyone else. Most men in his position would have done what they were told. George didn't. He understood that a rifle is only as serious as the man behind it. Inside the bunker, he listened to the constant hum of insects, the distant rumble of artillery, and the soft tick of mud drying on the barrel. He had no spotter, no radio, no extra hands. Just that rifle across his knees and 60 rounds he'd loaded himself. The banyan trees out there were monsters, some 90 feet tall, thick as water towers, and each one had enough crotches and shadows to hide a dozen men. Japanese snipers knew that ground the way a farmer knows his fields, and they could sit motionless for hours waiting for someone to walk into their sights. George glassed the branches slowly, left to right, top to bottom, listening for anything that didn't belong. When he saw the tiny shift of a dark sleeve high in the green canopy, he didn't smile, didn't whisper, didn't celebrate. He simply did what he'd been trained to do since he was a kid, shooting iron sights at Camp Perry. He let the crosshairs settle. He controlled his breath, and he squeezed a trigger that felt the same as it did the day he'd cleaned it in his parents' basement back in Illinois. A rifle round snapped across the grove. A body tumbled 90 feet through the branches and struck the jungle floor with a thud that told George everything he needed to know. The hunt had begun, and the rifle everybody mocked had just spoken its first word. George didn't celebrate that first kill because he knew exactly what it meant. If you dropped one sniper in a grove like Point Cruz, his partner was already somewhere close, waiting for the man who fired the shot to make his next mistake. The Japanese worked in pairs, and they were disciplined, patient, and confident. Every man in that grove believed the trees belonged to him. But for the first time in days, it wasn't the snipers who had the advantage. It was the quiet young lieutenant with the so-called deer rifle and the habits of a state champion who knew how to read stillness like other men read newspapers. He settled back into the shadows of the bunker and kept the scope low so the glass wouldn't flash. The banyan branches swayed in the faint breath of the jungle, and the world slipped into that strange silence only riflemen ever understand. At 9:43, he found the second sniper, a shape sliding down a trunk 60 yards north of the kill he just made, trying to break contact. George led the movement and squeezed, and the body fell backward through the green curtain like a rag doll dropped by a careless child. 2 shots, 2 kills, and the only sound in the entire grove was the Winchester's brass tinkling against stone. Word traveled fast through the battalion. Men who'd laughed at his rifle started whispering, casting glances toward the bunker. They wanted to watch, not to help, just to see how a man with 5 rounds and a bolt handle could stop the bleeding their companies had suffered for 3 days straight. George refused every offer. Spectators drew fire, and attention was the one thing he couldn't afford. He stayed alone, steady as the rifle in his hands, scanning the trees the way a man scans a shoreline for approaching weather. At 11:21, a Japanese round slammed into a sandbag 6 inches from his head. Dirt sprayed across his cheek, sharp and hot. He rolled left fast, hugging the bunker wall, and let the ringing in his ears fade before creeping back to his firing slit. The sniper who'd taken that shot had made his first mistake by firing from the southwest, a direction George had already mapped in his head when he took the position. When a sniper breaks discipline and fires from a predictable angle, he signs his own death warrant. George found him at 11:38, perched 73 feet up in a tight cluster of banyans, a slight dark shape where there shouldn't have been one. One shot sent the man dropping through branches like wet laundry off a line. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers, 5 men whose job was to make sure no American ever walked that grove safely again. But the Japanese weren't fools. They watched their losses, adjusted fast, and by mid-afternoon, they stopped moving in daylight. No shifts, no rustles, no silhouettes, just a forest full of eyes waiting for the American who dared to challenge them. When George returned to battalion headquarters near dusk, Captain Morris met him without the old smirk. The man who'd once called the Winchester a toy now sounded like someone who'd just seen a ghost carry a rifle. He told George to be in position again at dawn. The snipers hadn't gone anywhere. They were just digging deeper, learning him, preparing for the next round. The next day broke with heavy tropical rain, the kind that blurs the world into gray curtains and makes the biggest trees vanish behind a wall of water. George sat in the bunker and waited, fingers resting on the rifle, like a man waiting for an old friend to wake up. When the rain eased, he went back to work. At 09:12, he dropped a sniper at 290 yards, the longest shot he'd taken so far, and for the first time, the snipers answered him. At 09:57, the mortars began. A whistling sound sliced straight through the grove, followed by a blast that shook dirt loose from the bunker ceiling. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo came 20 yards closer. The third salvo would hit him dead on. George jumped from the bunker, sprinted north through tangled vines, and dove into a shell crater just as the bunker behind him vanished in a storm of dirt and splintered roots. He wiped the mud from his face, settled behind a fallen tree, and lifted the scope again. The game had changed. They weren't just defending their grove anymore. They were hunting the man who'd killed half their number in a single morning. That afternoon, he killed his 7th sniper at 14:23 and his 8th at 15:41. This one had climbed higher than the rest, 94 feet up, trying to use the sky as cover. But when the sun shifted, the silhouette betrayed him. George fired once, marking another silent fall through the branches. At 17 Huzura, he reported back to headquarters, mud-soaked, dehydrated, and calm in that unnerving way only veteran marksmen ever seem calm. He told Captain Morris the numbers: 8 confirmed kills in 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 4 misses. He knew exactly how many men were left in that grove. 11 in total, 8 down, 3 to go. And those 3 would be the hardest, the sharpest, the most patient men still alive out there. That night, George lay awake in his tent, listening to the rain beat against canvas. He knew the next morning wouldn't just be another hunt. Those last snipers wouldn't hide in the usual places. They'd watched every move he'd made for 2 days, and they'd adapt the same way predators adapt when you start thinning the pack. And at dawn, George would find out exactly how dangerous a cornered sniper can be. By dawn of the 3rd day, George understood he was no longer fighting ordinary marksmen. The last 3 snipers were the kind of men who survived because they didn't make simple mistakes, and because they knew exactly how to read the jungle just as well as he did. He moved before sunrise, slipping through wet brush to choose a new position, one the Japanese hadn't scouted yet. A cluster of rocks the Marines had used weeks earlier gave him elevation, cover, and the right angle into the groves. Gas. He settled behind them with water dripping down the back of his neck, the Winchester resting across his knees like a promise he intended to keep. At 08:18, he found the next sniper, a shape tucked low inside a palm, only 40 feet up, almost too easy. George felt something tighten in his chest, a little knot of experience telling him it wasn't right. A seasoned sniper didn't choose a spot that obvious, not with 8 of his comrades lying cold on the ground. He lowered his rifle and scanned the trees, slow, patient, mapping every trunk and shadow. It took 11 minutes to find the real threat high inside a banyan 91 feet off the ground, hidden behind a curtain of vines. The man was watching George's old position at the fallen tree, waiting for a muzzle flash that would never come. George understood the trap. The palm tree shooter was bait. The man in the banyan was the kill shot. So George used their own trick against them. He took aim at the decoy, fired, and watched the body tumble from the palm. Then he swung the Winchester instantly toward the banyan. He waited for the slightest shift, because a sniper will always turn toward the sound that kills his partner. There it was, just a small motion. Enough. George fired, and the 9th sniper dropped like a cut rope. But the jungle wasn't finished with him. Machine gun fire tore across the rocks a few seconds later, stitching the air exactly where he'd been lying. He dove into a drainage ditch, chest deep in muddy water, breathing slow and quiet as a stone. He waited until the world stopped shaking. Then he crawled through mud, relocated 100 yards east, and kept hunting. The last 2 snipers came at him differently. They didn't climb. They crawled, low to the ground, using vines and ferns for cover, sweeping toward the rocks in a wide movement meant to flush him from hiding. And for a moment the jungle held its breath. 2 men hunting the one who had hunted all the others. George stayed submerged until only his eyes broke the surface. He watched the pair move east in parallel lines, searching, tightening the net. When they passed his crater, he rose slowly, mud pouring off his uniform like a second skin. He took the first shot at 42 yards, worked the bolt, took the second shot before the other man could raise his rifle. 11 snipers in 4 days, every one of them dead before lunch. And just when the grove should have gone quiet, voices drifted through the trees. 6 men at least, maybe more. Not snipers, infantry. A recovery team moving toward the bodies. George slid back into the crater, the water cold against his ribs. The Winchester held upright to keep the barrel clear. He listened to boots in the mud, heard them find the first body, then the second, then the tracks he'd left behind. They followed those tracks straight toward him, 30 yards, 20, 10. A face appeared over the rim, eyes meeting his. George fired from the water, then fought his way out with 2 rounds left, and a dozen men trying to kill him. When he finally reached American lines just past 11, he looked like a ghost pulled from the bottom of a river. But he carried the same rifle, and he carried the same calm, the quiet kind older soldiers recognize instantly. Captain Morris asked for the numbers, and George gave them plainly. 11 snipers down, 12 rounds fired, and the battalion wouldn't lose another man in those groves. That evening, Division Headquarters sent an order for George to report. His commanding officers weren't calling him in to question him. They were calling him in because they wanted something bigger, something only he could do. And the question they were about to ask him would change the entire shape of the war for the men around him. When George walked into Division Headquarters that night, he expected a reprimand, unauthorized movements, solo engagements, operating without a spotter, burning through precious ammo. But the officers waiting for him weren't angry. They looked like men who just realized the war around them was changing faster than their manuals could keep up. At the center stood Colonel Ferry, a quiet man with a steady gaze, the kind of officer who listened more than he talked. He asked George a single question, and it wasn't about the kills. It was about the future. Could he teach other men to do what he had done? George told him the truth. He could try, but it would take time. rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot straight before they ever touched a scope. Ferry nodded once, like he'd already made up his mind days ago. He had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes left behind by the Marines, and 40 expert marksmen in the regiment. He wanted George to build a sniper section from scratch, shape it, and take it into the jungle. George accepted on one condition. He kept his Winchester. Training began 3 days later on a stretch of rough ground east of Henderson Field. The men lined up under the sun, most of them younger than George, all of them curious about the lieutenant who'd carried a toy rifle into a grove full of killers and walked back out alive. George didn't give speeches, didn't sell glory, didn't talk about his 11 kills. He started with breathing, the slow cycle of inhale and exhale that steadies a rifle more than any fancy equipment ever will. Then trigger squeeze, wind reading, understanding mirage, using terrain to create shooting platforms when the jungle refused to offer one. He reminded them the Springfield with its unertl scope weighed 11 pounds and would get heavier with every mile. A rifle wasn't just metal and wood. It was a burden you had to earn the right to carry. For 3 days he pushed them hard, harder than some of them liked. Stationary targets at 100 to 400 yards, then moving silhouettes, then targets half buried behind brush to mimic the cruel way vegetation distorts shapes. By the end of the 3rd day, he had trimmed 40 men down to 32, the ones who could put shots where they belonged, even with sweat in their eyes and fatigue nipping at their hands. He split them into 2-man teams, shooter and spotter, roles they would swap after every engagement, so no man became the weak link. Each pair learned to communicate with whispers, hand taps, and sometimes nothing more than a tiny shift of the shoulder. When they were ready, George took 4 teams west of the Guadalcanal River. The jungle there was quieter than Point Cruz, but it had the same uneasy tension, like the land remembered gunfire. George moved with a spotter named Hayes, a steady young corporal with sharp eyes and a calm that reminded George of the men who lasted longest in the National Guard ranges back home. Their mission wasn't glory. It was cleanup. Small pockets of Japanese infantry were still scattered near the trails, lost or hiding, and someone had to clear them before they ambushed the Marines advancing from the east. At 07:20 that first morning, a Japanese soldier stepped onto a narrow trail that cut between the ridges. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars, whispered once, and George fired. The soldier fell, and the forest sealed around the sound like it had never happened. Over the next 6 hours, their team engaged again and again. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss carried away by a sudden wind shift. The other 3 teams reported similar results. 23 enemy soldiers down before noon, not a single American wounded. It wasn't heroics. It was quiet, steady work. The kind that saves men without anyone noticing. As the sniper section grew sharper, word began to spread beyond the regiment. Other officers wanted to know how this little group of hand-picked riflemen was clearing trails faster than whole companies. But the truth was simple. George hadn't given those men superpowers. He'd given them discipline, patience, and a way to turn the jungle's chaos into something they could read like a familiar map. And right when the section reached its peak, the war decided to pull George somewhere far more dangerous, far more demanding than Guadalcanal ever was. Because in India, A new unit was forming, and they needed men who could survive deep behind enemy lines. Men exactly like John George. The orders came down while George was still running his sniper teams along the western trails. A runner brought a sealed packet, the kind that always meant your war was about to change shape, whether you liked it or not. Inside was a transfer to India. Assignment unspecified. Destination classified. All it said was that the Army needed experienced field officers for operations behind Japanese lines, and they wanted him on the next transport heading west. His men took the news quietly. They respected him the way soldiers respect someone who's walked into danger first and walked out last. But they also knew the war was big, and a man with George's skill wasn't going to stay in one jungle forever. By late March, he stepped off a troop ship into the hot air of Kolkata, surrounded by thousands of men training for a mission nobody could describe in more than a sentence. They called themselves Marauders, because someone said they were going to march into Burma the same way a hammer falls on a nail. 3,000 men, long-range penetration tactics, no supply lines except what you carried, and terrain so harsh that even the Japanese considered parts of it nearly impossible. George had seen bad jungle on Guadalcanal, but Burma was something else entirely. Rivers that swallowed mules, ridges so steep they tore boots apart, and humidity that turned every rifle into a rust project waiting to happen. George adjusted his equipment the way a craftsman adjusts tools before a long job. The Winchester that had saved his life in Point Cruz was still deadly, but Burma demanded a lighter load. He swapped the heavy Lyman scope for a Weaver 330 trimmed ounces from the stock, shaved every unnecessary bit of weight until the rifle balanced like something alive in his hands. It was still a Model 70, still the same heart and soul, just tuned for a different kind of war. The march into Burma began in February of 1944, and it wasn't a clean, sharp deployment like the movies sometimes pretend. It was sweat, mud, and miles. 80 miles the first week, 217 by the end of the first month, and every step through ground that wanted to break your legs or your will. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Others staggered on through fever, and the jungle swallowed the weaker mules until the unit had no choice but to shoot the ones that broke legs on the narrow ridges. If you've ever walked through heat thick enough to chew, you'll understand why even the toughest marauders started to look older every day. George didn't fire his Winchester often in Burma, but when he did, it mattered. Once at 412 yards, when a Japanese officer was directing troops across a river crossing. Once at 380 yards, into a machine gun nest, pinning down an entire column. Once at 290 yards, against a sniper who had pinned a patrol under a fallen log for nearly an hour. 3 shots, 3 kills, and every time, he moved immediately, because the sound of a bolt action in a silent valley can draw a bullet back at you faster than you expect. The Marauders reached Mitkaina by mid-May, starving, sick, and half-broken, but still fighting. It was one of the toughest campaigns American infantry had ever endured, and when the airfield finally fell, the unit was too battered to keep going. George survived, but the cost was written in the lines on his face and the weight he'd lost. His rifle survived too, though it had been used only 7 times in 3 months. A reminder that even the finest marksman must bend to the shape of the war around him. But while Burma took its toll on his body, something else waited for him back home. Something that would turn his quiet experiences into a document historians still study today. Because when George finally returned to the United States, the war wasn't the only thing about to change. A blank notebook was waiting for him, and he was about to fill it with every hard lesson the jungle had carved into him. When George came home from Burma, he didn't return as the young lieutenant who once crouched in a ruined bunker watching banyan branches for the slightest twitch. He came back leaner, quieter, carrying the kind of tired that doesn't wash off in a shower or fade after a week's rest. The army stationed him at Fort Benning, and for the first time since Guadalcanal, he slept in a proper bed, surrounded by walls that didn't shake when something exploded in the distance. His job was simple on paper: train infantry officers, teach them the lessons the jungles had carved into him. But simple jobs can weigh the heaviest when the memories behind them come with a price. He kept the Winchester. Of course, the rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, to Guadalcanal, to India, to Burma, and back again. He placed it in a footlocker in his quarters at Benning, wrapped in oiled cloth, ready but resting. Some nights he'd open the lid and look at it, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that a tool is only as steady as the hands that carried it. He didn't brag about what the rifle had done. He didn't tell students about the 11 snipers or the 3 kills in Burma. He talked instead about patience, wind, angles, concealment, and the discipline to wait for the moment that matters. You don't teach courage with stories. You teach it with habits. With the GI Bill covering tuition, George applied to Princeton and was accepted. He traded jungle mud for libraries, thick academic halls, and conversations that stretched late into the night. He graduated with highest honors, the sort of achievement most men chase their entire lives. Then he crossed the ocean again, this time to Oxford, studying politics and the structure of new nations. From there, he spent years in British East Africa, studying institutions, tribal governance, and the early stages of independence movements. It was a different battlefield, quieter, but no less demanding of patience and clear thinking. Through all those years, he didn't speak publicly about Point Cruz or Burma. His colleagues knew he had served, but they never knew how deep that service went. They never knew that the calm in his voice was the same calm he had once used to settle a rifle on a banyan branch at 240 yards. Some men come home and turn their war stories into trophies. George turned his into silence. But silence doesn't mean forgetting. In 1947, he opened a notebook and began writing down everything he remembered: the weapons, the ballistics, the human behavior, the mistakes, the rare decisions that kept him alive. He wrote with the precision of a craftsman and the honesty of a man who didn't want to impress anyone. 6 months later, his manuscript sat over 400 pages thick. A technical account rather than a dramatic one. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and insisted it needed to be published. George hesitated, but finally agreed. The book came out under the title Shots Fired in Anger, and without meaning to, George had created a classic. Collectors still use it. Historians still quote it. Marksmen still study the way he explained the quiet work of a rifleman in jungle war. He'd taken the lessons of Point Cruz and Burma and pass them forward to generations who'd never meet him, never hear his voice, never see the mud that used to cling to his boots. But while George found a new life in academia and foreign service, time kept moving, and so did the world he'd once fought in. Wars changed, rifles changed, armies changed, and before his story ends, there's one more place we have to go. A quiet room, a glass case, and the rifle most visitors walk past without ever knowing what it truly did. The rifle sits there now in a quiet room in Virginia, resting behind glass under soft museum lights. Visitors drift past it every day, children tugging at sleeves, parents skimming placards. Most of them never realizing they're walking past a survivor of 2 brutal jungles and 1 extraordinary marksman. The Winchester looks ordinary in that case, almost modest, with the same clean lines it carried when George first unpacked it from a wooden crate labeled fragile. No dramatic carvings, no exotic markings, just a tool built with care and carried by a man who understood exactly what skill really meant. If you lean close, you might imagine the way it once felt against a cold cheek inside a ruined bunker on Guadalcanal. You might picture the mud drying on its stock in Burma, or hear the bolt sliding forward with the quiet confidence of a craftsman who trusts his hands more than he trusts luck. And maybe, if you're old enough to have lived through a few storms of your own, you'll understand why George kept that rifle not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what one steady mind can do when the world is falling apart around him. George lived long enough to watch the world change in ways young soldiers can't imagine. He saw the Garand give way to the M14, then to the M16. He saw helicopters turn battlefields into 3-dimensional puzzles, saw satellites rewrite the meaning of distance, saw snipers become a formal specialty rather than an afterthought tucked into a battalion roster. But through all of it, he held on to one belief that never shifted. A man's skills matter, even when the world seems too big for one person to make a difference. And if you've ever carried a tool, any tool, long enough to feel it become part of you, you already know why that belief matters. Because George's story isn't really about 11 snipers or a mail-order rifle. It's about the idea that sometimes the thing everyone mocks is exactly the thing that keeps people alive. It's about the patience to wait through hours of silence for one moment that decides everything. It's about refusing to let other people define what you're capable of, especially when they don't see the years of practice behind your calm. There's a lesson there for all of us, especially those of us with a little gray in our hair. Now I'll tell you something straight. The way older vets sometimes talk when the room gets quiet. You and I know tools change, wars change, and the world moves faster every decade. But skill, discipline, and heart never go out of style. So let me ask you something, and I'd really like you to think about it. Do you believe a single marksman with the right rifle still matters in an age of drones and satellites? Or is that kind of craftsmanship becoming a relic, like George's Winchester resting behind glass? And one more thing, because it's a question that tells you a lot about yourself. If you had to trust one tool with your life today, the way George trusted that Model 70, what would it be and why? You'd be surprised how much a simple answer can reveal about the kind of person you've become. If this story meant something to you, friend, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more than you think, and it tells the world these old stories still matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be grateful if you did. We're keeping memories alive here. one story at a time, and I'd love to have you with us for the next one. Before you go, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if it's late, take care of yourself first. We're not 20 anymore, and you can always come back to hear the rest of these forgotten stories. George's rifle sits in that glass case, quiet and steady, but its lesson is still alive, still waiting, still speaking to anyone willing to pause long enough to hear it.